My name is Sierra. I am 25 years old and a sergeant in the United States Army. You know, the first rule you learn on the battlefield is that you trust your comrades to cover your back. But the biggest tragedy of my life did not happen in a combat zone. It happened right at the family dinner table. 8 months ago, I pried open the lid of a dusty cardboard box tucked away in my foster parents' basement. I was not looking for secrets. I just wanted to find some old childhood photos. But there were no albums. Instead, I found a stained tax return from 25 years ago. A single line was highlighted in a bright, ugly yellow, adoption tax credit, $5,400. Right underneath it sat a birth certificate for someone named Baby Girl Dunbar. I just stood there on the cold concrete floor as everything went quiet. I realized then that I was never a daughter. I was a logistics asset. I was a profitable piece of paperwork so my mother could play the saint in front of the local parish. Before I tell you how I used my military training to set a trap and shatter their perfect little world in the middle of the busiest restaurant in town, let me know where you are listening from in the comments. And hit that subscribe button if you have ever realized the person aiming the gun at you was the one you called family. The weight of my 30-pound tactical ruck felt like it was trying to fuse with my spine as I hauled it up the driveway. 3 weeks of field training in the North Carolina mud had left me with a layer of grit under my fingernails and a bone-deep exhaustion that usually only comes from being 25 and a sergeant in the United States Army. I expected a quiet house, maybe a cold plate of leftovers if I was lucky. But when I reached the door to my garage apartment, I didn't find a welcome home. Instead, there was a bright yellow sticky note slapped right at eye level. Lorraine's handwriting was unmistakable, slanted, and aggressive. The kind of penmanship that looks like she was trying to stab the paper with her ballpoint pen. It said, "Clean out the storage basement. Brittany needs the space for her things next week. No greeting. No thank you for your service. Just a task for her golden child niece while I was still smelling like damp canvas and sweat." My jaw tightened until my molars ached, but I didn't say a word. I never did. I just kicked off my mud-caked boots, rolled up my sleeves, and grabbed a stack of black trash bags. The air in the basement was thick enough to chew on, smelling of old cardboard and the kind of dampness that only exists in the South. I started shoving boxes of dusty Christmas ornaments and tangled outdoor lights to the side, trying to make room for whatever junk Brittany was bringing over. That was when I saw it. Tucked way back behind the rusty water heater, where the light from the flickering overhead bulb barely reached, was a small cardboard box. It was wrapped in layers of yellowed packing tape that had grown brittle with age. Someone had written Lorraine's name across the top in faded Sharpie. Usually, I respect privacy, but there was something about the way that box was hidden that made my military instincts prickle. I pulled my tactical folding knife from my pocket and let the steel blade slide through the tape. The sound was a sharp, dry rasp in the quiet basement. A cloud of gray dust puffed into the air as I pulled the flaps open, revealing 3 thick folders held together by heavy metal clips. I sat there on the cold concrete floor and pulled out the first folder. It was a birth certificate, the edges turning a sickly shade of yellow. Where the name should have been, it just said, Baby Girl Dunbar. My stomach did a slow, sickening roll. I knew my name was Sierra Levy, or at least I thought it was. But as I flipped to the second folder, the world as I knew it started to disintegrate. It was a copy of a tax return from 25 years ago, prepared by H&R Block. Right there on the 4th line, someone had used a neon yellow highlighter to mark a specific entry. It read, Adoption Tax Credit, $5,400. I stared at those numbers until they started to burn into my retinas. $5,400. That was the price tag. I wasn't a daughter they had prayed for or a child they had chosen out of the goodness of their hearts. I was a write-off. I was a financial transaction that helped Lorraine pay for the new siding on the house while she spent the next 2 decades telling the parish what a saint she was for taking in a nameless orphan. I mean, here's the thing about being a soldier. You are trained to spot a threat from a mile away, but you never expect the ambush to come from the woman who tucked you into bed. I didn't cry. You learn pretty quickly in the Army that tears don't solve problems, and they definitely don't cover your exit. My breath just stopped in my throat, leaving me in a state of total physical paralysis. The concrete floor felt like it was opening up under me, swallowed by the realization that my entire existence was built on a receipt. I looked at the highlighter mark again. Lorraine had probably smiled when she saw that number, thinking about the profit margin on my life. Every time she made me feel like I owed her for the roof over my head, she had already been paid in full by the government before I could even walk. I felt a cold, sharp clarity wash over me. It was the same feeling you get when you realize an ambush is set and you have to move or die. I took pictures of every single page with my phone, my hands steady even though my heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I put everything back exactly how I found it, resealing the tape with a fresh strip from the kitchen. By the time I walked out of that basement, Sierra Levy was gone. Sergeant Dunbar was the only one left. It was 2 a.m. by the time I pulled into the 7-Eleven parking lot. The neon sign was humming, a low electric buzz that matched the static in my brain. My friend Claire was already there, leaning against her dented Honda Civic with a cigarette hanging from her lip. She didn't ask why I sounded like a ghost on the phone. She just reached into her car and tossed a small plastic box onto the dashboard. It was an Ancestry DNA kit. I ripped the plastic off with my teeth, not caring about the bitter taste. I took the cotton swab and scraped it against the inside of my cheek, pressing hard until I felt the skin go raw. I wanted that DNA. I wanted the truth that wasn't written on a tax form. I snapped the head of the swab off into the vial of blue liquid, the plastic clicking with a finality that felt like a gunshot in the quiet night. I sealed the envelope and dropped it into the blue mail slot before I could second-guess myself. As I got back into my car, I picked up my phone and went through the settings. I muted Lorraine. I muted Brittany. I disabled every tracking app they had forced me to install. Operation Security was now in full effect. The countdown had started, and they had no idea that their logistics asset was about to become their worst nightmare. Saturday dinner at the Levy House was always a carefully choreographed performance, a stage play where everyone knew their lines except for the girl who was only there to pay for the lighting. Lorraine sat at the head of the table, wearing that ridiculous floral apron with the embroidered angels she used for church bake sales. The smell of burnt pot roast hung heavy in the air, a dry, acrid scent that seemed to cling to the curtains. She made a big show of scooping a massive, buttery mountain of mashed potatoes onto Brittany's plate, her eyes crinkling with a forced maternal warmth that never quite reached her pupils. When she turned to me, the smile didn't drop, but it flattened, becoming something sharp and clinical. She slid a plate toward me with the gristly, fatty ends of the roast, the parts even the dog would have second thoughts about. "The army feeds you well enough, Sierra," she said, her voice dripping with that saccharine sweetness that usually preceded a jab. "It is nice that you aren't such a financial burden on this house anymore." I stared at the congealing gravy on my plate, my jaw muscles bunching so hard it felt like my teeth might crack. Across the table, Glenn didn't look up from his peas, his fork scraping against the china with a rhythmic, irritating sound that filled the silence. I didn't say a word. A good scout knows that you never reveal your position until the magazine is locked and the target is in the crosshairs. I just chewed that leather-like meat, swallowed my disgust, and counted the seconds until I could get back to the garage. The first of the month arrived with the kind of gray, oppressive humidity that makes the air feel like a damp wool blanket. I walked into the kitchen, the floorboards creaking under my boots, and saw Lorraine waiting by the granite island. She didn't have to ask. I pulled 4 crisp $100 bills from my wallet and laid them flat on the counter. That was my BAH, my basic allowance for housing, money I earned by sleeping in the dirt and humping a ruck through the swamps of Fort Liberty. I watched her long manicured fingers reach out and stroke the bills, her thumb and forefinger testing the texture of the paper like she was making sure I hadn't printed them myself. "I will just put this toward the utilities for the garage," she murmured, her eyes fixed on the cash. "You have to understand, Sierra, supporting a grown woman is an expensive undertaking for people our age." Glenn stood by the sink, his back to us as he obsessively scrubbed a coffee mug that was already clean. He was a man who had mastered the art of being a ghost in his own home whenever Lorraine started her shakedowns. I just nodded. A short, sharp motion that offered nothing. I was paying $400 a month to live in a drafty garage with a leaky roof and a floor that smelled like motor oil, while Brittany slept on a luxury pillow-top mattress in the guest room for free. It was the price of my cover, a rental fee for the silence I needed to finish my investigation. Later that night, I lay on my cot in the garage, staring up at the water stains on the ceiling that looked like a map of a country I didn't want to visit. My mind started playing back 25 years of memories like a grainy, black-and-white film strip. I remembered the way Lorraine used to tell me that she chose me when no one else wanted me, a phrase she used like a leash whenever I tried to show a spark of independence. I remembered the pristine Christmas cards they sent out every year, featuring the three of them smiling in front of the fireplace while I was tucked into the corner of the frame, a living prop to prove their charity. Every gift she ever gave me came with a mental invoice, a silent reminder that my existence was a debt I could never truly repay. I thought about the church pews, the way the congregation whispered about what a blessing the levies were for taking in an orphan. It was a perfect, polished lie, a decade-long exercise in cold, calculated gaslighting. My heart felt like a cold stone in my chest, heavy and unmoving. I realized then that I had never been a daughter to them. I was a long-term investment, a tax deduction that turned into a source of steady income once I joined the service. The 6th week felt like it lasted a century, every day a slow crawl through the motions of military life. I was sitting in the DFAC at Fort Liberty, the air filled with the clatter of stainless steel trays and the loud, boisterous laughter of soldiers who still had families worth going home to. I was staring at a scoop of grayish rice, my appetite long gone, when the phone in my pocket gave a sharp, distinctive buzz. I didn't rush. I set my spoon down carefully and pulled the device out. There it was, sitting on the lock screen like a digital ticking bomb, the little green leaf icon of the Ancestry app. The subject line was in bold, unforgiving letters. Your DNA results are ready. I felt a sudden surge of heat prickle at the back of my neck, my vision narrowing until the only thing in the world was that screen. I swiped to open it, my thumb hovering over the glass for a split second of pure, unadulterated fear. The app loaded, a spinning circle that seemed to mock the frantic rhythm of my heart. Then, the data populated. At the very top of the list, under the heading for immediate family, was a name I had never heard in my entire life. Evelyn Vance. 100% match. I stared at that name until the letters started to blur. I didn't finish my meal. I stood up, dumped my tray into the trash with a loud metallic bang that made a few people turn their heads, and walked out into the blinding North Carolina sun. The logistics asset was officially offline. I'm curious, have you ever felt like a guest who had to pay for their own seat at the family table? Let me know in the comments where you are listening from tonight. If you believe family should be about more than just a tax write-off, please hit that like button and subscribe to help me get this story out there. I sat in my truck, the engine ticking as it cooled down, and stared at the glowing screen of my phone. The data didn't lie. 99.7% match. The name was Evelyn Helen Dunbar. She was 47 years old, a registered nurse, and she lived in a town called Ridgemont, just a 2.5-hour drive from the base. My biological mother. I opened a new email draft, my thumbs hovering over the glass. I didn't want to sound desperate, but I didn't want to be cold either. I wrote it like a sitrep, a situation report. My name is Sierra. I believe you are my biological mother. I am not angry. I just want the truth. I hit send before my nerves could short-circuit. 4 hours later, my phone chimed. The reply was short, filled with typos as if her hands were shaking too hard to hit the right keys. I have been staring at the screen for an hour. I have been waiting for this email for 25 years. Sunday morning, I drove into Ridgemont. The town was quiet, filled with old oak trees that shaded the streets like giant protective umbrellas. I pulled up in front of a modest, single-story house with a tire swing hanging from a branch in the front yard. The front door flew open before I even unbuckled my seatbelt. A small woman in faded blue nurse scrubs practically sprinted onto the porch. She froze at the top of the steps, her hands gripping the railing so hard her knuckles turned white. her chest was heaving. Helen didn't say a word. She just limped down the stairs, her arms wide open. I'm a sergeant. I'm trained to stand at attention to keep a professional distance. But my legs, my soldier legs, just moved on their own. I stepped into her embrace, and for the first time in my life, I felt the air leave my lungs in a way that didn't hurt. I was small again, tucked into the arms of someone who actually wanted me there. A tall man with grease-stained hands stepped out from the garage, wiping his palms on a tattered red rag. This was Tom, Helen's husband. He didn't look at me like I was a budget item or a trophy to show off to the neighbors. He reached out and gave my hand a firm, calloused squeeze, the kind of handshake that tells you exactly who a man is. "Welcome home, kid," he said, his voice a low rumble that felt like a shield. Behind him, a 20-year-old kid in a baseball tee, Cody, my brother, just bumped my shoulder and grinned. There were no prying questions about my military pay or how much I was spending on rent. In that house, which smelled like slow-cooked beef stew and motor oil, I realized what a real unit felt like. It wasn't about the show. It was about the people standing next to you. After lunch, Helen led me into her bedroom and reached under the bed for an old, rusted butter cookie tin. When she opened the lid, she didn't pull out money or deeds. She pulled out a tiny, brittle strip of pink plastic. It was a hospital ID bracelet with baby girl Dunbar printed in fading black ink. Her fingers traced the edges as if it were a holy relic. "I was 22, she whispered, her voice cracking. "My parents. They locked me in my room. They told me I was a disgrace to the family name." She looked me in the eyes, her gaze raw and honest. "They forced me to sign those papers while I was still groggy from the meds. They told me you were going to a better place." I sat there, the bitterness of 25 years of Lorraine's charity turning to ash in my mouth. I wasn't a baby who had been thrown away or unwanted. I was a prisoner of war. I'd been snatched away from a mother who had spent every single year since then lighting a candle on my birthday, hoping I'd find my way back. I looked at that pink bracelet and realized Lorraine hadn't saved me. She had bought me from people who used my mother's vulnerability as a bargaining chip. The real battle was no longer about finding my past. It was about what I was going to do to the people who had stolen it from me. 3 weeks before my 25th birthday, I came home from a back-to-back night shift at the base feeling like a battery that had been drained to zero. My boots felt like lead weights, and my mind was a fog of range scores and logistics reports. I pushed open the door to my garage apartment, wanting nothing more than to face-plant into my pillow and disappear for 10 hours. But Lorraine had left me a little homecoming gift. It wasn't a warm meal or a welcome back card. It was a computer-printed sheet of paper sitting right on the closed lid of the toilet. She knew that was the one place I would have to look before I could even think about sleeping. The title was in bold, crisp, black ink. Notice of Lease Amendment. I felt a cold prickle of sweat on the back of my neck as I read the second line. My rent was being increased from $400 to $850 a month, effective in 30 days. Right at the bottom, in her dainty slanted handwriting, she had added a postscript. If I didn't agree to the new terms, I was required to vacate the premises within 14 days so Brittany could move her things in. Actually, here is the thing about Lorraine. She's a master of the financial ambush. She knew exactly what my BAH, my basic allowance for housing, was down to the last cent. She knew about the small monthly payment I was making on my student loans. She had timed this perfectly to bleed me dry of every single dollar of my military housing allowance right before I hit a major milestone in my life. It was a calculated move to either keep me under her thumb as a permanent source of income or toss me out like a piece of expired logistics equipment that no longer served her bottom line. I stood there staring at that paper for a long time, the smell of the damp, oil-stained garage air suddenly feeling like it was choking me. My heart wasn't racing. It was doing the opposite. It was slowing down, hardening into a cold, flat stone. I wasn't a daughter to her. I wasn't even a tenant. I was a revenue stream that had outlived its initial profitability, and she was looking to squeeze one last payout before the contract expired. I didn't wait to catch my breath. I grabbed the paper, my fingers leaving smudges on the fresh ink, and marched across the small patch of dead grass to the main house. I pushed through the kitchen door without knocking, the weight of my uniform still pressing on my shoulders. The smell of pancakes hit me, sweet, buttery, and completely at odds with the rage simmering in my gut. Glenn was standing at the stove, flipping a pancake on a heavy cast iron griddle. When he saw me, he jumped so hard he dropped his stainless steel spatula. It hit the floor with a loud metallic clang that seemed to echo through the entire house. I slapped the notice down on the granite counter, right next to the maple syrup. I asked him what he had to say about a 110% rent increase in a single month. Glenn wouldn't even look at me. He kept his eyes fixed on the dirty dishes in the sink, his shoulders hunched as if he were trying to disappear into his own shirt. He reached over and turned the faucet on, letting the water roar at full blast to drown out the sound of my voice. He mumbled something about Lorraine having her reasons and how inflation was hitting everyone hard. He was a 52-year-old man who was terrified of the woman he married, a coward who used the sound of running water to hide from the reality of his own cruelty. I realized then that the man who stays silent while you are being bled dry is just as dangerous as the one holding the knife. I folded the paper into a tight square and shoved it into my pocket. I was done looking for an ally in that house. That night, the quiet alleyway behind the garage was illuminated by the dull yellow glow of a street lamp that flickered every few seconds. My friend Claire, a combat medic who had seen me through the worst of my training, pulled her dented Honda Civic up to the door. We didn't talk much. We just started unloading stacks of flattened cardboard boxes from her trunk. The sound of the packing tape was a harsh, rhythmic rasp in the still night air. Rip, rip. Each strip of tape felt like a seal on my old life. Claire leaned against the brick wall, the tip of her cigarette glowing like a tiny, angry star in the dark. She asked me why I didn't just blow the whistle on them right now. Why I was letting them squeeze $850 out of me for a glorified crawlspace. I kept my head down, taping the bottom of a box with a firm, decisive motion. I told her that if I fired my shot now, I would lose the element of surprise. I was planning a tactical withdrawal. I had already found a place in Ridgemont, a small one-bedroom just 2 blocks away from where Helen lived. It was $650 a month, and I had already filed the paperwork for a transfer. I wasn't just moving, I was preparing to dismantle Lorraine's entire defensive perimeter from the outside in. 2 days later, there was a knock on the garage door. It was curt, impatient, and familiar. I opened it to find Lorraine standing there in a floral sundress, her lips painted a deep, bruised purple. She was holding a tin of oatmeal cookies, her face frozen in that tight, Botox-assisted smile she wore for church functions. She called me her sweet Sierra and told me that turning 25 was such a huge milestone. She said she and Glenn wanted to take me to Maggie's restaurant this coming Friday night. She claimed they wanted to talk about some important things regarding my future. Her eyes kept darting past me, trying to peer under the heavy canvas tarp I had used to hide the stacks of packed boxes. She smelled like expensive perfume and greed. I stood there, my face a mask of military indifference, and I just nodded. I told her I would be there. Friday night at Maggie's. I watched her walk away, her heels clicking against the pavement with a satisfied rhythm. She thought she was baiting a trap to secure her final payout. She had no idea that she had just invited the wolf to her dinner table. I went back inside and closed the door, the smell of her perfume lingering in the air like a warning. The target was acquired, the coordinates were set, and Friday night was going to be the last time the Levies ever saw me as a victim. It was 7 p.m. on Friday when I pulled into the gravel lot of Maggie's restaurant. The place was packed, a chaotic symphony of clinking silverware against heavy porcelain and the low, constant hum of a town that lives for gossip. The air inside was thick with the smell of fried catfish and the cloying, suffocating scent of Lorraine's rose water perfume. She had chosen table 4, right in the center of the room, where the light from the overhead neon signs could catch the shimmer of her silver necklace. It was her stage, her battleground. Glenn was sitting next to her, his shirt buttoned all the way to the top, like a man trying to keep his soul from leaking out. He kept rubbing his palms together, a nervous, dry sound that set my teeth on edge. I pulled out the chair opposite them, my movements deliberate and quiet. Before I sat, my eyes did a quick sweep of the room, a habit I couldn't break. There, tucked behind a thick oak pillar in the east corner, were three figures sitting in the shadows. Tom was wearing a clean flannel shirt, but I could still see the faint smudge of oil on his neck. Helen was sitting perfectly still, her eyes fixed on her menu. Cody just gave the slightest nod. The assets were in place. I took my seat and laid my hands flat on the table, the cool wood grounding me as I prepared for the final engagement. The waiter hadn't even cleared the appetizers before Lorraine went on the offensive. She didn't offer a happy birthday or ask about my week. Instead, she reached into her designer bag and slid a clear plastic folder across the table, right past my untouched salad. Inside was a document titled Termination of Residency Agreement. Her voice was a sharp, pressurized whisper, intended only for my ears but carrying enough venom to kill. She told me that there was no need to beat around the bush anymore. She said they had kept me around as long as the tax code made it profitable, but now that I was 25, those government incentives had dried up. She actually looked me in the eye and said the duty of this household was complete. She produced a gold-plated ballpoint pen and tapped it against the table with a rhythmic, irritating click. "Sign this," she said, "and I'd have 30 days to get my things out." If I fought her, she promised Glenn would have a lawyer on the phone by morning. I didn't pick up the pen. I didn't even look at the paper. I kept my gaze locked on hers, my eyes like twin gun barrels aimed straight at the center of her pride. I let 5 seconds of silence stretch between us, then 10. Around us, the diner was a blur of noise, the jukebox playing a fading country song, the laughter from the bar, but at table 4, the air was freezing. My silence was a weapon, and I could see it starting to fray her nerves. A small twitch started in her upper lip, the first crack in her polished porcelain mask. She hissed at me to sign it, telling me not to make her lose face in public. I tilted my head just a fraction, my voice coming out flat and steady, like a countdown. I asked her if, after 25 years, a final tax report was really the only thing she had to say to me. That was the spark. My contempt acted like acid on her ego, eating through the saintly facade she had spent decades building. Lorraine slammed both of her hands down on the table so hard the water glasses rattled and the silverware jumped. She didn't care about the neighbors anymore. She leaned forward, her face turning a mottled, ugly purple as she abandoned her whisper for a jagged, ugly snarl. Her voice carried across the next 3 tables, stopping conversations in their tracks. She asked me who I thought I was, reminding me that she had pulled me from the trash when no one else wanted me. She called me an ungrateful brat. Then, she went for the kill. She spat out that my biological mother was probably some low-life nobody from Ridgemont. A pathetic woman who couldn't even take care of herself, let alone a kid. The words hung in the air like a poisonous fog. The diner went deathly quiet as the people at the surrounding tables turned their heads, their forks hovering halfway to their mouths. Lorraine was breathing hard now, her eyes wide and wild with the narcissistic high of finally saying the things she'd kept hidden behind her church smiles. She thought she had won. She thought she had finally put the logistics asset in its place. But in that moment, I wasn't the one she needed to worry about. From the shadows behind the east pillar, the heavy sound of a wooden chair screeching against the floorboards cut through the silence like a jagged blade. I didn't move a muscle, but I felt the shift in the room's atmosphere. The ambush was triggered. Pastor Jim and his wife stopped mid-bite at the table next to us, their forks frozen halfway to their mouths as the air in Maggie's restaurant suddenly turned thin and cold. Even the cashier at the front desk stopped counting 20s and leaned over the counter to see what the commotion was. The hum of the town's Friday night gossip died a quick, ugly death as Lorraine's screech echoed off the wood-paneled walls. I didn't look at the crowd. I kept my eyes on Lorraine, whose face was currently a shade of purple that matched her bruised-looking lipstick. I reached into my olive-drab jacket pocket and pulled out a thick, brown accordion envelope. I didn't hand it to her. I slammed it down onto the center of the table with a heavy final thud that made the salt shakers dance and the water glasses rattle. You know, here's the thing about people who build their lives on lies. They always forget that paper has a long memory. I told her that since she loved talking about money and where I came from so much, We were going to make everything crystal clear for every single person in this room. I pulled out the first sheet of paper, that stained tax return from 25 years ago, with the neon yellow highlighter streak burning through the ink. I pointed to the number, $5,400. I made sure to say the numbers loud enough so they reached the back of the diner. I told her that was the exact price of the sacrifice she had been bragging about at the parish for over 2 decades. Lorraine's mouth fell open, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps as she stared at the physical proof of her own greed. Glenn, on the other hand, looked like he was trying to physically retreat into his own skin, his shoulders hunching up as he gripped his fork like it was the only thing keeping him from floating away into the abyss of his own cowardice. I didn't stop there. A good tactical strike requires you to dismantle every single layer of the enemy's defense. I pulled out 2 more documents and pinned them to the table with my palms. The first was the Ancestry DNA report, showing that 99.7% match in bold black letters that screamed the truth. Then I slapped a color photo on top of it. A picture of me, Helen, and Tom, standing under the oak trees in Ridgemont just a few days ago. I told her that this was the woman she just called a lowlife in front of our neighbors. I made sure everyone heard me when I explained that Helen hadn't thrown me away. She had been coerced into signing those papers when she was just 22, still groggy from hospital meds and terrified of parents who treated her like a disgrace. I watched the red on Lorraine's lips turn pale as she realized her saintly savior story was officially dead on the floor. She reached for her water glass, her hand shaking so hard the ice cubes rattled against the glass like a warning bell in the silence. But the real ending, the final blow of the mission, wasn't in the paperwork. I reached into my wallet and pulled out a single, crumpled $1 bill. I didn't place it in her hand. I tossed it onto the middle of her untouched salad, right on top of a wilted piece of lettuce. I told her to consider that a tip for 25 years of playing the role of a mother for the cameras. I told her right then and there that I didn't owe her a single cent. Not for the increased rent, not for the utilities in that drafty garage, and definitely not for her fake love. I pushed the plastic folder with the residency agreement back toward her and told her she didn't need to call a lawyer. I informed her that I had already sat down with a JAG officer on base. There wasn't a single law in North Carolina that allowed a parent to sue for legal separation or financial damages from a 25-year-old sergeant who was simply done being exploited. Her cheap psychological warfare had reached its expiration date, and the man sitting next to her didn't have enough spine to even look me in the eye. Lorraine was gasping for air now, her eyes darting around the restaurant like a trapped animal looking for a hole to crawl into. She saw Karen, who had worked at the post office for 30 years and knew everyone's secrets, covering her mouth in genuine shock. She saw Pastor Jim shaking his head slowly, his disappointment heavy enough to feel from across the room. The loss of power, the sudden stripping away of her saintly mask in front of the people she lived to impress, was causing her to unravel in real time. She tried to hiss that I was making it all up, that I was just trying to get out of my obligations to the people who raised me. I just stood up, my height making me a shadow over her terrified, sweating face. I lowered my voice, making it cold and precise so it echoed through the center of the diner. I told her there was one more thing she needed to know. I told her that my family was actually here, right now, and they had heard every single word of her insults. I turned my head toward the shadows of the east pillar and gave a sharp, single nod. Actually, it's funny how the people who claim to have saved you are often the ones you need saving from the most. Have you ever had a moment where you finally stood up and let the truth speak for itself? Let me know in the comments where you are listening from tonight. If you believe justice is best served in front of a crowd, hit that like button and subscribe to see how this mission ends. From the shadows behind the thick oak pillar, the sound of a wooden chair screeching against the floorboards finally broke the silence. It was a heavy, deliberate sound that made every head in Maggie's restaurant turn. 3 figures stood up. They didn't shout, and they didn't rush. They moved with the quiet, synchronized precision of a unit that had spent the last hour observing the enemy's every move. Tom led the way, his heavy work boots thudding against the floor with a rhythmic finality. Helen followed, her face pale, but her eyes burning with a fire I had never seen before. Cody brought up the rear, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, his gaze scanning the room to make sure no one interfered. They didn't stop until they reached our table, forming a literal wall of denim and flannel behind my chair. The atmosphere in the diner shifted instantly. It wasn't just a family argument anymore. It was an occupation. Helen stepped forward and did something Lorraine had never done in 25 years, without an audience or a camera nearby. She reached out and placed a thin, trembling hand on my shoulder. Her palm was warm, even through the fabric of my jacket, and the weight of it felt like an anchor in a storm. Tom stood directly behind me, a massive silent tower of a man whose presence seemed to physically shrink the space around Glenn. I looked at Lorraine, who was still gasping like a fish out of water, her mouth opening and closing as she stared at the woman she had just finished slandering. "Lorraine," I said, my voice cutting through the quiet like a cold blade. "This is Helen Dunbar. She is my mother." The word mother felt like a grenade going off in the middle of the table. Lorraine tried to stand up, her knees knocking against the underside of the wooden table so hard that her wine glass tipped over. The deep red liquid poured across the white tablecloth, soaking into the residency agreement I had refused to sign, blooming like a dark, ugly stain. She pointed a shaking finger at Helen, her face contorting into a mask of pure, unadulterated venom. "You!" she hissed, her voice cracking under the weight of her own desperation. "You have no right to be here. I raised that girl. I spent 25 years dealing with her when you were too weak to even keep her." Helen didn't flinch. She didn't raise her voice, but the authority in her tone made the entire room lean in. "I am not here to argue with you, Lorraine. I am here because my daughter asked me to be. You didn't raise her, you stored her. You treated a human being like a piece of property you could leverage against the government." Lorraine turned her head wildly, looking for someone, anyone, to back her up. She looked at Glenn, but the man was paralyzed. Tom was staring him down with a silent, simmering fury that made Glenn look like he wanted to crawl under the floorboards and die. He wouldn't even lift his chin from his chest. The silence in the restaurant was absolute. Even the kitchen staff had come out to watch. Lorraine, realizing she was losing her audience, turned toward the table where Pastor Jim was sitting. She clasped her hands together, her eyes welling up with those practiced fake tears she used whenever she wanted to win a church council debate. "Jim!" she cried out, her voice echoing off the ceiling. "You know us. You know how much we've given. Tell them we're good people." Actually, here's the thing about small towns. The truth travels faster than a lie can hide. Pastor Jim, a man who had served in the Navy long before he ever picked up a Bible, slowly set his napkin down. He didn't look at me, and he didn't look at Helen. He looked directly at Lorraine with a tired, heavy disappointment that was far worse than anger. "I think this is a matter you need to take up with the Lord, Lorraine, but I will say this. There is a vast difference between opening your arms to a child and opening your ledgers to a tax credit." The judgment wasn't a roar. It was a quiet, devastating fact. The sound of the pastor's voice seemed to be the final blow to Lorraine's defensive perimeter. She looked around and saw the faces of her neighbors, people she had spent decades trying to impress. And all she saw was pity and disgust. She snatched her designer bag off the floor, her movements frantic and clumsy. She didn't say goodbye. She didn't look at me one last time. She just turned and bolted for the exit, her heels clicking a desperate, uneven staccato against the wood. Glenn practically tripped over his own chair, trying to follow her, keeping his head down and his eyes on the floor as they disappeared into the darkness of the parking lot. The restaurant remained quiet for a long beat after the door swung shut. I sat there, feeling the warmth of Helen's hand on my shoulder and the solid presence of Tom and Cody behind me. For the first time in 25 years, I wasn't waiting for the next attack. I wasn't an asset or a deduction. I was just a person, surrounded by the people who had chosen to be there. The air in the room finally felt clear. I looked at Helen, and for the first time, I didn't see a stranger. I saw home. The heavy glass door of Maggie's restaurant swung shut with a final, muffled thud, cutting off the sound of Lorraine's frantic heels hitting the pavement outside. For a moment, the diner was so quiet you could hear the low hum of the refrigerator in the back and the distant rhythmic scrape of a busboy's broom against the floorboards. Maggie, the owner, walked over from behind the register, her face unreadable as she looked at the mess left behind. She didn't look at me with pity. She looked at me with a nod of recognition that you only get in a small town when a bully finally gets knocked down. Maggie grabbed a roll of paper towels and threw them onto the center of the table, right on top of the deep red wine stain that had soaked through the residency agreement. She snatched the wet, ruined document and tossed it into a nearby trash can without saying a word. "Dinner is on the house tonight," Maggie said, her voice gravelly and firm. "Consider it a celebration for a family coming back together." She didn't mention the name Levy. She didn't have to. The air in the room suddenly felt lighter, like a pressurized cabin finally stabilizing after a breach. Tom pulled out the chair where Glenn had been sitting just minutes ago, his massive frame filling the space with a solid, grounding presence. Cody leaned over and nudged my shoulder, sliding a plate of fries toward me. "Eat up, sis. You look like you haven't had a real meal since basic training." I realized then that my shoulders, the ones that had been locked in a permanent defensive shrug for 25 years, had finally dropped. I wasn't Sergeant Dunbar for a second. I was just Sierra. Helen reached into her bag and pulled out a craft paper envelope. It was worn at the edges, the paper soft and gray from being handled thousands of times. She pushed it across the table toward me, her fingers lingering on the surface for a heartbeat before letting go. "I wrote these for you," she whispered. "Every year, on your birthday, when I was sitting in that empty room, wondering where you were." I opened the flap, my hand slightly unsteady as I pulled out the first letter. The ink was faded, and there were faint, circular crinkles on the paper where old tears had dried long ago. I read about the cold hospital room and the way the nurses had taken me away before she could even see my eyes. I read about the 25 years of guilt she carried, thinking I had grown up hating her for something she couldn't control. Every word felt like it was scrubbing away a layer of the lie Lorraine had built, the lie that I was unwanted. Actually, here's the thing about being a soldier. You are taught that medals are the only things that prove your worth. But as I reached into the bottom of that envelope, I found something that made every ribbon on my uniform feel like cheap tin. Helen opened a small rusted cookie tin that had been hidden inside, and there it was, the pink plastic hospital bracelet. It was brittle now, almost translucent with age, with Baby Girl Dunbar printed in a blocky, digital-style font that was starting to flake off. Helen took my left wrist in her hand. Her skin was rough, the skin of a woman who had worked for everything she had, and she carefully slid that old piece of plastic over my hand. It felt scratchy against my skin, a physical connection to a past I thought was a blank space. Lorraine had her receipt for $5,400, but I had this. This was the only medal I ever really needed to see. It told me I had a name before I had a price tag. By 10 p.m., the adrenaline had faded into a deep, heavy exhaustion, the kind that feels like you've been on a 3-day ruck march. We walked out into the parking lot, the North Carolina night air smelling like pine needles and wood smoke. Tom's Ford F-150 rumbled to life, the headlights cutting through the darkness. He rolled down the window and looked at me, his eyes steady and calm. "We'll be waiting for you in Ridgemont," he said. "Your keys are on the kitchen counter. Cody and I will be there in the morning to help you move the big stuff." I just nodded, a lump forming in my throat that I couldn't swallow. I watched their taillights disappear around the bend before I turned toward my own car. I climbed into the Honda Civic, but I didn't start the engine right away. I sat there in the dark, looking at the pink bracelet on my wrist. The mission at Maggie's was a success, but the exfiltration wasn't complete yet. There was still one more stop to make. I had to go back to that oil-stained garage one last time to pack the final boxes and scrub the last trace of the levees out of my life. I didn't feel angry anymore. I just felt focused. I shifted the car into gear and pulled out onto the gravel, heading toward the house that was never a home, ready to finish the job. By 11 p.m., the garage apartment was bathed in the harsh, unflattering glow of a single overhead bulb that made everything look like a crime scene. Claire didn't say much. She just stood there with her hands on her hips, watching me shove the last of my olive-drab t-shirts into a cardboard box. We worked with a rhythmic military efficiency. I stripped the sheets off the spring mattress and stuffed them into a black heavy-duty trash bag, the plastic crinkling loudly in the quiet night. I realized, with a cold sort of clarity, that my 25 years under the Levy roof had boiled down to exactly 4 boxes and 2 bags of trash. There was no childhood blanket I wanted to keep. There were no framed photos worth the space in the trunk of my car. Everything that mattered to me was already in my head or on my person. I mean, here's the thing about a tactical withdrawal. It is not about running away. It is about leaving nothing behind for the enemy to use. I scanned the room one last time, my eyes landing on the bare walls and the oil-stained floor. Up in the main house, the windows were pitch black. Lorraine and Glenn were huddled in there like cornered rats, hiding behind the curtains after the explosion at Maggie's. They didn't have the stomach to come out and face a sergeant who was officially off their payroll. They didn't even try to stop me. I watched the silhouette of the big house, waiting for a door to creak or a light to flick on, but there was nothing. Just the sound of crickets and the distant hum of the highway. By 1 a.m., the trunk of the Civic slammed shut with a definitive metallic thud. Actually, I had one final task before I turned the ignition. I walked into the kitchen of the main house, my boots echoing against the expensive granite floor that my tax credits had likely helped pay for. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the ring of keys. I dropped them onto the counter, and the sound they made, a sharp, rattling jangle, felt like a gavel hitting a bench. Next to the keys, I placed a small yellow sticky note. It was the same kind Lorraine had used to bark orders at me for years. On the back of it, I used a thick black marker to write a single sentence: "You do not need 30 days, and I do not need you. Mission ended. Do not contact me again." I didn't look back. I walked out the door, the cool night air hitting my face, and I felt the weight of that house fall off my shoulders like a discarded rug. 2 weeks later, I was sitting on the porch of my new place in Ridgemont. The air here smelled different, cleaner somehow. I was holding a mug of black coffee, watching the sun crawl over the oak trees, when my phone started vibrating on the wooden table. It was a long, rambling text from Glenn. I didn't even have to read the whole thing to know the flavor of it. He started with the usual, "I am sorry about what happened," but then he immediately pivoted to making excuses. He claimed Lorraine was having a nervous breakdown. He said the whole town was talking. Apparently, Karen from the post office had told everyone, and Pastor Jim had officially removed Lorraine from the church fair committee. He even mentioned that Brittany had moved out because she couldn't stand the dirty looks people gave her at the grocery store. He begged me to come home and talk, saying he only stayed quiet to keep the peace. I stared at the screen, my thumb hovering over the glass. I felt a wave of pure, unfiltered disgust for the man. A man who watches his child get bled dry and calls his silence keeping the peace is the ultimate coward. He wasn't worried about me. He was worried about his own comfort now that the house was quiet and the neighbors were whispering. I didn't reply. I didn't send a single character. I just tapped on his contact info and hit block. The phone went silent, and I felt a surge of adrenaline that was better than any victory on the range. The steel boundary was set. No contact, no explanations, no way back for them. Actually, the fallout in Fayetteville was even worse than Glenn let on. In a town like that, your reputation is your only currency, and Lorraine had just declared bankruptcy in front of the entire parish. Word travels faster than a brush fire in those circles. Nobody wanted to rent that garage apartment from someone who had been exposed for skimming tax credits off a foster child. Lorraine was stuck in that big, empty house with an empty garage and a husband who couldn't look her in the eye. She had lost her power at the church, she had lost her saintly image, and she had lost the only person who had actually tried to earn her love. I mean, here's the real kicker. The most devastating punishment for a narcissist isn't a lawsuit or a shouting match. It is the total loss of an audience. Lorraine Levy was now a woman living in a museum of her own greed, surrounded by empty rooms and a community that saw her for exactly what she was. She was finally alone with the one person she couldn't manipulate, herself. I took a sip of my coffee, the heat grounding me, and I looked out at the Ridgemont Road. My life was finally my own, and for the first time in 25 years, the silence didn't feel like a threat. It felt like a fresh start. It is March 15th. A full year has passed since the plates stopped rattling at Maggie's, and the air in this town finally started to feel breathable again. I am 26 today. In my new apartment in Ridgemont, the air does not smell like motor oil or damp, neglected cardboard anymore. Instead, it is thick with the heavy, savory scent of Tom's steak sizzling on the cast iron, and the rich, garlicky aroma of Helen's lasagna cooling on the counter. Cody is currently hunched over the kitchen island, struggling to keep 3 lopsided candles upright on a store-bought chocolate cake, while Claire sits on my sofa with her boots kicked off, nursing a cold, long-neck beer. I look around at these white walls, at the stack of mail on the entryway table that features only my name, and I feel a strange, grounding sense of peace. I bought this place with a VA loan, a benefit I earned with my own sweat and years of service in the dirt. Every single bill that comes through that door, from the electric to the water, is paid by me, for me. There are no yellow sticky notes on my toilet lid anymore. There are no ledger entries tucked away in the back of someone else's mind about how much I owe them for the simple cost of existing. In this room, the word gratitude is not a weapon or a debt. It is just a feeling that sits quietly in my chest. Actually, here's the thing about time. It does not just heal the cracks. It redecorates the entire house. After the party cleared out and the sound of Tom's Ford F-150 faded into the distance of the Ridgemont night, I found myself standing alone by the window. I turned off the overhead lights and lit a single white candle, letting the hot, translucent wax drip onto a small porcelain saucer until it held the base firm. I stood it on the windowsill and watched the tiny flame dance against the dark reflection of the glass. For 25 years, Helen told me she lit a candle like this every March 15th to remember a baby that had been stolen from her hands before she could even memorize the shape of my nose. It was a light for the missing, a beacon for a ghost she refused to let go of. But tonight, this candle is not for an MIA child. It is for the woman standing here. The reflection in the glass shows a jawline that is still sharp and a posture that is still disciplined. But the tension in my brow has finally smoothed out. I do not look like someone waiting for a sudden strike or a financial ambush anymore. I look like someone who survived the war and finally put the ruck down. I ran my fingers over the cool, smooth surface of my dining table and thought about Lorraine and Glenn for the first time in months. Look, being a soldier teaches you a lot about resource management. You learn early on that you only have so much energy, so much focus, and so much ammunition in the magazine. Carrying hatred for people who have already been defeated is a massive waste of psychological resources I simply cannot afford to spend. I realized tonight, as the wax cooled on the saucer, that I do not hate them anymore. To hate them would be to give them a permanent bunk in my head, and I have officially evicted every trace of their influence. Lorraine's attempt to crush me financially, her screaming insults at the restaurant, and Glenn's cowardly silence were not just attacks. They were my discharge papers. They were the final, brutal proof that the discipline of the Levy House was never a family bond, but a prison sentence I was forced to serve. I won the day I walked away and stopped asking for permission to be whole. The silence they left behind is not a void. It is a space I have filled with my own voice. I lifted my left wrist and let the dim candlelight catch the edges of that brittle pink hospital bracelet. It rattled slightly against my skin, a dry and ancient sound that reminded me of how far I had traveled. For a quarter of a century, I was a logistics asset. I was a profitable line on a tax return for a couple of narcissists who traded my childhood for a $5,000 deduction. But that mission is over. I have found my true command center now. A place where love does not come with an invoice attached, and loyalty is not a transaction. I looked out at the Ridgemont sky, clear and vast and full of stars that did not care about tax codes or legal agreements. I felt the weight of the bracelet, the weight of my own name, and the weight of a future I actually want to see. Mission at the Levy House is officially complete, I whispered into the quiet room. The veteran has finally come home to a place where the doors stay unlocked and the heart stays open. The sky was dark, the air was still, and for the first time in my life, the silence was not a threat. It was freedom. This story serves as a powerful reminder that our inherent worth is never defined by the price tags others place upon us. Sierra's journey from a logistics asset to a woman of independent strength teaches us that family is not merely a matter of shared blood or legal signatures, but of unwavering respect and genuine protection. For anyone standing in the shadows of a toxic environment, the greatest victory lies in the courage to walk away. True healing begins the moment you stop seeking validation from those committed to misunderstanding you and start building a life where your peace is non-negotiable. It is never easy to confront the ghosts of the past, but seeing justice served in that small North Carolina diner brings a sense of closure we all crave. We want to hear from you. Have you ever had to draw a steel boundary to protect your own heart? Perhaps you have found a chosen family who stood as your shield when you needed it most. Please share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. Your words might be the lighthouse someone else needs tonight. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel to ensure you never miss another story of resilience and rebirth.